Welcome to Universal Design for Learning in the series Support for All. Hi, I'm your host today, Nicole Krod. I'm an MLTI ambassador, and when I'm not an ambassador, I am a 7th grade science teacher at Mount Ararat Middle School. I've put my email here if you want to reach out and talk about any of the UDL information, whether you need just a thought partner or someone to work with you on these concepts. I'd love for you to reach out. This video is featuring Joshua Schmidt, who is also an MLTI ambassador, and we'll get introduced to him a little bit later. I've included the bit.ly and a QR code for the bit.ly so that you can go straight to this presentation on Google Slides. And from there, you can make a copy and make it your own. And then also I've included the MLTI YouTube channel, which has lots of resources for professional development. All right, let's get started with Universal Design for Learning. So today we're going to talk about what and why UDL. And whenever you see that UDL, it stands for Universal Design for Learning. We're going to talk about the principles of UDL, and then I'm going to give you some resources and tools for your classroom. So let's dig right in. What and why Universal Design for Learning? So you're going to see a few different acronyms. You might see this as UDL, you might see this as UDI, you might also hear UX, which kind of is melded in with this concept. So I'm going to walk you through those and explain the different terms as we go. So I think before we explain the definition of UDL, I want to talk about this idea of variability, which if you are a teacher in a classroom, you know this exists. So this is the idea that students are different in many ways: interests, strengths, challenges, experiences, and backgrounds. So in your classroom, you are not, you don't have one student that's the same. Like, you have many multiple different interests, backgrounds, all of those things. And we know that variability exists. So when we start to think about universal design for learning, this is that we're teaching to that variability. We're thinking about that and planning for it. Universal design of instruction is the design of teaching and learning products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And then the UDI is really the idea of that universal design of instruction. And then UDL is a framework. So CAST, which is a website, a company, has created this framework to improve and help us to create this. And I'll show you that a little bit later. UX is also the words that you, or the acronym that you kind of see thrown in with this. And UX stands for user experience. And really, some of these things extended from like the video game world. So when we think about user experiences versus user design, we're really looking at the experience, what the player or the person is going to experience versus the design itself and how it's created. So UD started with architecture, and it's the idea that your plan is flexible and that you're accommodating for all users, with or without disabilities. And if you're designing for those in the margins, it turns out that your building or your lesson or whatever it is that you're planning for will work better for everyone. And a great example of that is thinking about ramps and curb cuts. If you build that thinking, okay, I need someone with a wheelchair to be able to get into the building, you also have an opportunity for someone with strollers, delivery people, bikes, and it becomes a place where everyone has access. Another example of this is closed captioning. My husband is hard of hearing, and I know that we have the closed captionings on, and I appreciate them. So it helps me so that I don't miss words or miss something. I can kind of look and say, oh, what was that? And so even though it's designed for deaf and hard of hearing people, people learning English, or people in gyms, or spouses with different sleeping times. Those are all advantages. And it's really taking the stigma out of, okay, if you're deaf, like the only people that are using this are deaf or hard of hearing. Whereas when it's on and it's available all the time, then it's there for anybody to use, and it's not just for those with a disability. And then I love this cartoon because it really kind of captures all of that. Is thinking about, this person that's clearing off these steps, and could you please shovel the ramp? And they're like, no, I've got to do this for this group of kids. But if you shovel the ramp, then we can all get in. And that's really what UDL is at the heart of things. This is Shelly Moore, and she does a lot with UDL and inclusive design. I encourage you to check her out, and we're going to look at her analogy around bowling.
Hi, my name is Shelly Moore, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. As Canadians, we have a reputation for finding and embracing the strength in our diversity. This value, however, hasn't been reflected in our classrooms, which still segregate students by ability, especially students with developmental disabilities. There's a gap in our understanding about what we know inclusive education to be philosophically versus what we understand and the importance of understanding inclusion in our practice. This is the question I'm trying to answer in my research, is how can we find the value in the day-to-day practice in our classrooms in terms of inclusive education? So how am I going to explain this to you? Now I can sit here and try and describe this, or we can have a little bit more fun. Why don't we go bowling? So let's talk about bowling. You have 10 pins, you have 2 balls, and you have a lane. The goal is to knock down as many pins as you can. But if you don't get them all, it's okay because you have another chance. But when I bowl and roll the ball down the middle and I don't knock them all down, what often ends up happening to me is that there's 2 pins left standing on either end, and they stare at you. It's the 7-10 split, and it's the hardest shot in bowling. How is bowling like teaching? The ball is the lesson, the pins are the kids. We aim for the middle, we do the best we can. The pins are left standing. We often have another chance to kind of get to them, but at the end of the day, those 2 pins that are staring, looking at you, are kids who need the most support and are kids who need the most challenge. So we end up choosing one, and the other one is left standing. I just took all the fun out of bowling. Now, I don't know how many times you've watched professional bowling, but I spent an afternoon watching professional bowling. And let me tell you, there was not one bowler who rolled that ball down the middle of the lane. They throw the ball down the lane at a curve. And I was actually really curious about this. So I called up a professional bowler. He was so excited. I don't think he gets a lot of calls about education. He said the reason why the ball has to enter at a curve is because you will knock down more pins and create a bigger domino effect if you enter at that angle. But in order to do that, you have to change your aim. In order to knock down the most pins with one shot, he aims for the pins that are the hardest to hit. Now let's just let this sink in for a second. We are taught to teach the head pins. We are not taught to teach the kids who are the furthest and the hardest to get to, the kids with autism, the kids with Down syndrome. The part that's critical here, and it really aligns with universal design for learning, is that so often the supports that we design for those kids on the outside of the lane are actually supports that all of the kids need. This is the part we need to understand if inclusive education is going to move forward in Canada. How can we find this value of diversity in our classrooms between the students? This is not just important for the outside pins, but it's critical for every single one of us. And just think, all we need to do is change our aim. Look how bowling changed education.
I love that. What a great explanation of UDL through bowling. So thinking about, hitting all of the kids and not just the average, and to do that, aiming for the ones that are the hardest to teach, the ones that need the most accommodations. And we're going to look a little bit more about kind of the ideas and ways that you can do this. So the second thing I'm going to talk to you about is the principles of UDL. And this is where CAST, which is a nonprofit education and development organization, created a universal design for learning. They created a framework, a guidelines that's used all over. And so that website has been linked here, and I encourage you to check it out. But we're going to look at their framework. And their framework looks like this. It's pretty dynamic. Just to look at it the very first time, it's a little overwhelming. And so we're going to break it down a little bit because, like I said, it is dynamic, and they've organized it in such a way that it makes sense once you kind of are let into how it's organized and what is happening here. So this framework is made up of guidelines and checkpoints. So each of these boxes are our guidelines, and then each of the little pieces in there are checkpoints. And then we're going to look at how it breaks down even further. So this is organized into 3 different columns. You've got engagement, representation, and action and expression. So let's come back to engagement. So this column is all about the why of student learning, what students find motivating and how they stay engaged. And really the idea is that you're looking to provide multiple means of engagement, recruit interest, and build motivation. And that's all about that engagement piece. And if you think about this, this is in lesson planning, this is the first piece that you address, right? You're trying to hook the student in. And then as you go, you're also trying to keep their engagement and have them interested throughout. The next one is representation. So this is the what of learning, thinking about how learners process information and making meaning from it. And again, we're looking at multiple ways and multiple means of representation, making information accessible and understandable. And then the last column is action and expression, and this is the how of learning. So when we think about this, this is how a learner demonstrates their understanding. And again, multiple means of ways to show what they know. Then we start to look at the rows. And so with the rows, we're looking at access, build, and internalize, and then also the goal. So let's start with access. So this is all about making information accessible. And you can kind of see recruit interest, perception, physical action. And then the second piece is about building. So really this is a gradual release of responsibility. So when you're thinking about this first piece of making information accessible and kind of looking at the teacher as the facilitator, this is that next step, kind of that piece where you're teaching them about what skills and ways for them, you're preparing them for ownership of learning. And then the last one is really internalizing. And someone had said this is like the hidden curriculum, which I love, like self-regulation, comprehension, executive function, those things that you don't always see, but they're super important for learning. So thinking about all of that and helping learners understand themselves as learners. And then the last piece is ultimately, this is our goal, right? We want learners that are purposeful and motivated. We want them resourceful and knowledgeable, and then strategic and goal directed. So when we think about this framework, it's not a curriculum. It is not a checklist. We want to look at it as a lens, a philosophy, something where we are intentionally planning for all of our students. In order to do this, let's look at Dive into UDL by Kendra Grant and Louis Perez. They take this framework and introduce it with the idea around a swimming pool. Some of us are going to be wading in. This is new for me. I'm vaguely familiar with the term and I would like to know more. Some of us will be a shallow swim. I've heard of this and understand some aspects. I'm ready to learn more and still have questions and want to improve my practice in this area. And some of us will be at a deep dive, feeling confident in your understanding and want to expand my knowledge and refining my practices and ready to support others. This makes the very detailed framework that we looked at before a little bit more approachable. If you are at the very beginning of this, start small. Start by wading in, thinking about where can I give voice and choice in engagement, representation, action, and expression. We ultimately want our students to be expert learners. So we can reflect on our own learning in order to do this. And we can do that out loud, modeling the tools that we use, how we choose from the choices that we have, and how it aids in our own learning. So thinking about when you've chosen to read something aloud on Audible. I do that all the time when I'm driving. It's often, as a busy teacher, it's often the way that I access books is through Audible, because it is where I can get my information and I can do it in the car. That's a tool that I use that might be made for someone that can't see to read, but it's a tool that everybody's able to access, and it's convenient for me to use in the car. So again, providing that voice and choice for your students to pick their accommodations, pick their modification, pick their tools that will help them push their learning forward, and modeling them that for them, as well as highlighting when a tool works really well or if a tool didn't work well, thinking, well, that's not something I'm going to use again because it didn't help. So let's take a look at how one educator interprets UDL in their classroom.
Right, so we're here with Joshua Schmidt to talk about UDL. Josh, want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, I'm Joshua Schmidt from the MLTI Ambassador team here at the Maine Department of Education. Before this role, I was a middle school math teacher in China, Maine for 5 years, and a middle school and high school math teacher in South Dakota for 7 years. And when you brought up this topic, I was really excited to talk about it because coming from smaller schools, like you don't have always as many resources. So making your classroom as accommodating for as many students as possible is always the goal.
Excellent. Well, welcome, Josh. How do you interpret UDL in your classroom?
Yeah, and I think this is one of those things that's kind of transitioned over time for me. When I started teaching, especially when I first started getting the students who needed accommodations or modifications, I would kind of create those on the fly for that specific student, and then I would kind of like remove that accommodation if it wasn't necessary. A few years into my career, I realized that rather than kind of make those after the fact and make them for one student at a time, I kind of started thinking about how I could structure my class to be accommodating for students before they get there. And what I ended up finding out was that way more of my students were using those accommodations and modifications than I ever would have guessed. And it kind of just changed my entire mindset on, just construction of content in general, rather than kind of make it for groups and accommodate to the edges. It's make it as accommodating as possible when you begin, and then you don't have to do as much of that editing down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've been trained to do that, right? Where our special ed is kind of teach to the average, and then a special ed is what we're modifying or coming up with accommodations. And with anything, like I think about closed captioning. My husband is hard of hearing, and when he has the closed captioning on, like I benefit from that just as much as he does. And so it's one of those things that it's designed for him, but then I access it as well.
Well, and that actually brings up something that happened to me. A big game changer was when I started using video resources in my classroom, because I had a lot of absent students. I just needed to make something so they didn't have to come see me the next day when they were back. It was already available. And I just added on closed captions because that was a feature of Edpuzzle at the time. And I discovered that way more of my students were choosing to use that than I ever would have guessed. And if you ask them, they all have a slightly different reason why they prefer that, but it's one of those mindset changes where it didn't take any extra effort on my part to create that accommodation for more students than one, but it ended up being beneficial for a huge number of them all at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I think that's where You know, sometimes I think we make this harder than what it is. Like you have a wheelchair ramp, we're not going to just say, well, that's just for people with wheelchairs. Like when we're planning for more than just the average, like you're going to find that it benefits all. Are there other tools or tricks or tips that you use that you find as you're planning your lessons or looking at kind of designing for all that you use?
I think the biggest thing for me is that make sure the technology is designed to support whatever you're doing. I think that's been a big mindset change. Whereas when I first started teaching, I just wanted to create like the coolest thing possible. And now that I've been teaching a little bit longer, I think about students that I've had in my classes in the past and whatever modification or accommodation was helpful to them at that time, I try to include that when I start the lesson. So rather than creating a lesson and adding those accommodations later, I create it with those accommodations in mind when I begin. And I would say probably the biggest trick that I have for anybody is if you're using something like, the Chrome browser, there are so many incredibly powerful tools built into those extensions that you can use with tiny amounts of effort. Things like read aloud can be built into Google Docs. You can have, voice to speech activated in there. Even something like a mouse that can be controlled with your webcam already exist within those programs. And they don't always work perfectly, but I think it's just making sure you're creating that content with those types of students in mind, rather than changing it after you get one specific student who has a specific need.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting to me is like our kids are already doing this, right? Like they find those, tools and they're like, hey, this is cool and it helps me. And so bolstering that and helping them to do that, picking like, hey, this is a tool that helps me. It's an accommodation I can use to get my learning that much further.
Well, and it changes the mindset in your classroom altogether. Rather than, because I know I've had students who have certain accommodations they don't want to use because it stands out and everybody in the room notices that accommodation is happening. Not only do some of these tools are built to be private, if you change the mindset in your classroom away from accommodations are only for that small subset of kids, you'll discover a huge number of your students are excited to use those things because they're really, really helpful no matter, where you are in the learning spectrum for that skill.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And ultimately what we're doing is we're teaching students to find those tools and access help when they need it, right? And trust me, I have a hard time asking for help. So finding those things, it's good to teach them explicitly.
Thank you, Joshua. That was such a great conversation. I heard a lot of good things about mindset and how you need to change your mindset around accommodating for one versus planning for the variability and purposefully planning for that in your classroom. It was interesting to me how you talked about the students making their choices of closed captioning and how they all had their reasons, but they were able to choose. And that's what we want our students to do. We want them to be those expert learners that have that ownership that says, I need this tool to help. And then the last little nugget of information that you gave us was really to use that tech to our advantage, as well as using something that I've come up with in the past as an accommodation that I know that can be helpful for a student. And instead of providing that for one student, really, again, purposely putting it into the implementation of a lesson at the beginning. A lot of really great things. Thanks, Josh. So let's talk resources. So here I've set up a few links that you can click on. There is the CAST links, which this is the UDL guidelines, the ones that we looked at. When you click on this, you can actually go to their website and go through and everything. So all the guidelines, the checkpoints, they all are linked. And so you get a little bit more of a breakdown of each one of those so you can check them out. They also have some online tools, some links to different things that you can use, and some tips and tricks. UDL for Teachers is a great website because it takes each one of those guidelines and checkpoints and it breaks it down into a video so that you get even more information and kind of can hear. It's just another way of hearing and learning about the guidelines. I'm going to come down here to 5 more minutes. This is Shelly Moore, the person that we heard earlier, and she has a YouTube channel, a podcast, and a website. And she just does a nice job of explaining UDL and giving strategies that just makes sense. So it's worth checking out. And then the other things that I found are just a few articles, a checklist that will help you as you're starting out and kind of thinking questions along the lines of like, did you think about this? This website, Dive Into UDL, that is from the book, and she really breaks down things to have that 3-layered approach as far as like, are you just wading in? Are you swimming in the shallow end? Or are you doing a deep dive? She also has a self-assessment on there to see where you're at, which is worthwhile to take. And then there's this toolbox, and I put 3 exclamation points on it because it is a good one, of just different strategies. So these are all UDL aligned, and it's taken each one of those checkpoints. This one's recruiting interest. Well, that's the guideline, and the checkpoint is optimize individual choice and autonomy. And it's given you just a list of things that you can do, and it explains each one of those. So this one's alternative seats, giving choice and different types of seating or equipment for students. And you can click on that and see a little bit more about it. So that's definitely worthwhile to check out. And then lastly, I would encourage you to continue this series, because next week when we talk about accommodations and modifications, I will be looking at that through a UDL lens. So I'm going to have lots of resources through that. So the MLTI YouTube channel is here for more resources around that. Thank you for joining me today, and I want to thank you for making your classroom and the world a more inclusive place. I'm going to ask you, what will this look like in your classroom? Will you wade in and reach out and contact Joshua or myself to consult about UDL? Our email addresses are off to the right if you would like to contact us. Maybe you're going to go for a shallow swim and apply and do more research around what you've viewed today. If you want, the bit.ly link is there along with the QR code and the MLTI YouTube channel so that you have all the information from today and more. Or maybe you're at the point where you're in a deep dive and you're going to continue to apply what you've learned and keep intentionally planning for variability. Thank you so much, and I hope you join me for my next video on accommodations and modifications in this series, Support for All.